Everything Joe Dispenza teaches, breaking the habit of being yourself, becoming the observer, elevated emotion, was never meant to be separate ideas, it's one system. And that's what this video breaks down, not just another explanation of his ideas, the complete framework. Everything Joe teaches connected into one model in the order it actually works. And it starts with one question: what exactly are you trying to change? Now, most people would probably answer that by saying my habits, my circumstances, my career, my relationships. Joe goes much deeper. He says before any of those things, there is something called your personality. Now, most of us, when we hear the word personality, we think about character, like maybe someone's funny, someone's quiet, someone's confident, someone's introverted, almost like personality is something you're born with. However, Joe means something very different. Joe has a specific way of putting it. He says your personality creates your personal reality, and your personality is simply made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. Not three separate things, one loop feeding itself. Let me give you an example. Have you ever driven somewhere, parked the car, turned off the engine, and suddenly realized, I don't even remember the drive? Like you stopped at traffic lights, you changed lanes, you turned corners, you avoided other cars, but your mind was somewhere else entirely. Your body already knew the route. Joe says that's not just how driving works, that's how much of life works. You've repeated certain kinds of thinking, feeling, and reacting so many times that they no longer feel like habits, they feel like you. Joe believes your thoughts, they work the same way. At first, a thought is something you consciously think, but repeat it often enough, and eventually your brain starts thinking it for you. Now, why this idea matters so much is because if Joe is right, then your personality isn't some permanent truth about who you are, it's a pattern, and patterns can be changed. Now, before we get there, there's an obvious question that if people really can change, why don't they? Because almost everyone has had the experience of like wanting something different. We all have bought books, watched videos, set goals, felt motivated, sometimes we're genuinely excited, and then a week later, we're somehow back to where we started. Why? By the way, what I'm sharing isn't just theory, it's what took me from being a lawyer to starting my own companies, making six figures in my mid-20s, and later negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. Joe's answer to that question before is surprisingly simple, because your mind is not the only thing trying to stay the same, your body is too. Let me explain that by an example. Imagine that you've had the same routine for the last 10 years. Same morning routine. You wake up, walk straight to the kitchen, make a cup of coffee, sit in the same chair, look at your phone. But now imagine someone secretly rearranges your entire kitchen overnight. The coffee mugs are in a different place, the coffee itself is somewhere else, the spoons have been moved, and the kettle is on the opposite side of the counter. What happens the next morning? Without thinking, you still reach for the old cupboard, you walk toward the old place, your body follows yesterday's map. And only after a few seconds you do realize that everything is different. Joe believes emotions work the same way. Your body learns familiar emotional routes, not just happiness, everything like stress, frustration, worry, guilt, self-doubt. Whatever you repeat most often, your body starts expecting and eventually producing. This is one of Joe Dispenza's most famous ideas. He often says the body becomes the mind. At first that sounds strange until you think about everyday life. For instance, have you ever had someone ask you what's wrong and you answered nothing even though something clearly felt wrong? Sometimes your body, it knows that you're stressed before you've consciously admitted it. Like your shoulders will tighten, your jaw will clench, your breathing changes, and your stomach just feels heavy. All before you fully caught up mentally. Joe would say that's years of conditioning happening automatically. Think of it like a thermostat. Imagine the thermostat in your house set to 18 degrees. Every time the room gets warmer, the cooling system switches on. Every time it gets colder, the heating switch is on. Its job is simple: return to what's familiar. Joe believes your emotional life develops a thermostat too. Maybe let's say yours is set to worry, or maybe it's set to frustration, maybe it's set to feeling like you're never enough. Even when life briefly gets better, something just quietly pulls you back towards what's familiar. Not because you want that, but because your body has learned this is home, and that's why change feels so difficult. It's not just about learning something new, It's about teaching your entire system a new version of normal. Joe has a name for this old familiar version of you. He calls it the known personality. It's known because your nervous system has rehearsed it thousands of times. It's predictable, safe, home. And that word matters because everything Joe teaches after this is really one long answer to a single question. How do you stop living from the known long enough to become someone unknown? By the way, if you're finding this valuable, I've done a similar breakdown for Neville Goddard and Abraham Hicks too, connecting their entire teachings into one model like we're doing here. I'll attach the link in the description down below. Now notice how everything connects. If your personality is really just a loop, then the next question becomes incredibly important. How do you interrupt a loop that's been running for years before it simply starts again? Joe doesn't think it starts with changing your emotions or changing your thoughts. It starts one tiny step earlier. For example, imagine someone sends you a message that immediately annoys you. Before you've even finished reading it, you're already typing a reply. Like your fingers are moving, your mind is building its case, then you stop. You read what you've written, and suddenly you realize, if I send this, I'm going to create the exact situation I always create. For a brief moment, nothing outside has changed. The message is still there, the emotion is still there, but for the first time, you have a choice. Joe believes that's where change begins. Not after the reaction, not hours later when you're reflecting on your day, in that tiny moment before the old pattern takes over. Joe has a specific term for this moment. He calls it becoming the observer. Not fighting the pattern, not suppressing it, just watching it from a half step outside it, which is enough to break its grip. Now here's what's interesting. Joe isn't asking you to suppress the emotion. He's not saying never feel angry, never feel anxious. He's asking for something much smaller. Notice it. Notice the pattern while it's happening. Joe believes awareness works in a similar way. The thought still appears, the emotion still knocks on the door, but now you're watching it happen instead of becoming it. That one shift changes everything because a pattern can only keep running if nobody notices it's running. Joe says that's the beginning of breaking the loop, not by fighting the old program, but by becoming conscious of it. If your personality is built from repeated patterns, then you don't become a new person by collecting new information. You become a new person by interrupting the old repetition. That's why Joe spends so much time talking about awareness. Without awareness, there is nothing to interrupt. And once you've interrupted the old pattern, a new question naturally appears. What do you replace it with? Because stopping an old habit is only half the story. Let me actually make it more concrete and share an example. So imagine you finally stop reacting the way you always have. So someone criticizes you, and this time you don't become defensive. For a moment, there is just silence. Now what? If you don't consciously choose a different way of thinking, a different way of feeling, a different way of responding, the old pattern quietly comes back. Not because it was stronger, but because it was the only one your system knew. Joe says the same thing happens in your mind. Interrupting the old pattern creates space, and now you have to teach your system where to go instead. This is where meditation enters the picture, and I think this is one of the biggest misunderstandings about Joe's work, because most people hear the word meditation and they immediately think relaxing, sitting quietly, clearing your mind, trying not to think. But Joe is not primarily interested in relaxation over here, he is interested in rehearsal. For example, think about a concert pianist. Months before the performance, they're not only practicing the piano, sometimes they're quietly sitting, moving their fingers through the piece in their imagination. They're hearing every note, feeling every movement, and by the time they walk onto the stage, their nervous system has already experienced the performance hundreds of times. Athletes do something similar. Before a gymnast performs a routine, before a basketball player takes the final shot, before a diver steps into the platform, many of them mentally rehearse the exact sequence, not because imagination magically changes reality, because the brain learns through repetition. Joe takes the same principle and applies it to your identity. You're basically rehearsing a future version of yourself. For instance, imagine the version of you who already speaks confidently. How do they walk into a room? How do they respond to criticism? How do they make decisions? How do they carry themselves? Notice something important. Joe is not asking you to rehearse the event. He's asking you to rehearse the person. That's a huge difference because most people, they visualize getting the promotion. Joe asks, who are you after the promotion? Most people imagine finding the relationship. Joe asks, who are you inside the relationship? Most people imagine success arriving. Joe asks, what does success feel like before anyone else can see it? Because according to Joe Dispenza, your brain doesn't learn from experience, it also learns from repeated mental experience. He calls the two ingredients a clear intention and an elevated emotion. The intention is the thought, what you're rehearsing. The elevated emotion is what makes the rehearsal count, like gratitude, love, a genuine feeling of wholeness actually felt in the body while you rehearse, not just thought about. The more vividly you rehearse intention paired with elevated emotion, the more familiar that future version starts becoming. And remember the thermostat we talked about earlier? You're slowly changing where it resets. You're teaching your system, this is my new normal. Now naturally a question appears, how do you know whether that's actually happening? Because it's easy to sit with your eyes closed, it's easy to imagine, but how do you know something is genuinely changing instead of simply daydreaming? Joe says you'll notice something before your circumstances do. You'll notice your emotional state changing first. I'll explain. Let's imagine two versions of the same morning. In the first one, you wake up, you check your phone, you see a stressful email, and within seconds your mood changes. The email decided how you were going to feel. Now imagine another morning, the same email arrives, you read it, you still understand it's important, but something inside you stays steady. You're calm, you're present, clear. The email didn't disappear, you simply didn't become the old version of yourself. Joe believes that's one of the earliest signs that your inner pattern is changing. The outside world hasn't changed, but your relationship with it has. Joe would say emotional change works the same way. The first evidence isn't necessarily a new job or more money or a different relationship. It's noticing. It's noticing the things that used to trigger me, they don't pull me in the same way anymore. That's why Joe often says you have to feel the future before you can see it. Not because you're pretending, because your internal state begins changing before your external circumstances reflect it. And if that happens often enough, one final question remains, what does it look like when this stops being something you practice and simply becomes the way you live? That's where Joe's final practice takes us. Now let's zoom out, forget the individual principles, and let's rebuild Joe's entire model as one story. Imagine your life is like a hiking trail through a forest. The first time someone walks across a field, there's barely a path, but they walk it and then they walk it again and again, hundreds of times. Eventually the grass disappears and a clear trail forms. So clear that nobody even questions it anymore. It's just the way. Joe says your mind works the same way. A thought creates a feeling, the feeling shapes a behavior, the behavior creates an experience that strengthens the original thought. Every repeat cuts the trail a little deeper until you stop choosing the path starts choosing you. That's the known personality. Now imagine deciding to walk somewhere else. The old trail is still there, it's still the easiest route, your feet drift toward it automatically, and noticing that pull is becoming the observer. Walking through the tall grass anyways before there is a clear path is rehearsal, intention held with elevated emotion, and one day, without noticing when it happened, the new direction becomes the easy one. You don't have to remind yourself anymore, you just walk there. And you've stepped, as Joe would put it, out of the known, and the unfamiliar path has become your new known. That's not 6 separate teachings, it's one mechanism seen from 6 angles. Here's what Joe actually asks people to do, as close to his own words as I can put it. Do it in the morning before your day had a chance to trigger any of your old programs, before the phone, before the emails, before the world starts asking things of you. Sit, let your body settle, breathe slower than usual until you just drop out of that wide awake, thinking about everything state into something quieter underneath it. And from there, don't just picture a scene, rehearse who you are inside it. Not, I get the job. Instead, how does this version of me sit, breathe, think, respond when nothing is testing them? And Joe is specific that thinking it is not enough, you have to actually feel it. Gratitude, wholeness, whatever emotions belong to that version of you has a real sensation in your chest. an idea in your head. He calls this a combination of a clear intention held with elevated emotion. That pairing is what tells your body the future has already happened. Then go live your day. You'll slip, everyone does. The old trail will pull you. That's not failure, that's the practice. Notice it, pause, choose again. That's what Joe's model actually is. Not a collection of techniques like meditation, journaling, visualization, treated as separate boxes to check. One mechanism, interrupting the old pattern, rehearsing the new one, repeat. Or in Joe's own words, stop living by the familiar past and start living by the memory of your future. If you want the same breakdown for Neville Goddard and Abraham Hicks, I've done it for both. Links are in the description and on your screen, and I'll see you there.